Hi, this is Tawny from the Dirty Bits podcast, and you're listening to California Dreaming on the Orbital Jigsaw Network.
This episode of California Dreaming is brought to you by Blubrry. Blubrry offers the best media hosting, accurate listening stats, their all-new PowerPress Deluxe site, a no-setup WordPress website for your podcast, and it comes with all of the necessary links to share your show with the world built right in. Head over to www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to set up for media hosting, a PowerPress Deluxe site, get that podcast you've been dreaming about started, and get your first month for free. That's www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream. And now, on to today's show. I am going to talk to you today about taboos. Forbidding an action based on the belief that such action is too sanctified or too accursed for people to participate in. Almost every society across the globe has their own sets of taboos, and what might be taboo to one group of individuals may not be for another. Like certain foods may be considered taboo to eat, either by custom or religion. Something may be completely unacceptable for one group, but perfectly fine for another. Taboos are in place in order to protect people. However, there are other reasons for some taboos, such as medical reasons, ecological, religious, or spiritual. In some cultures, taboos can help in the utilization of resources in a more efficient manner. They may help in the cohesion of a group of people, creating a feeling of community and belonging. The word itself has been expanded to include a very strong prohibition of a number of human behaviors and activities that are forbidden based on moral considerations, religious beliefs, or cultural norms. And for anyone to break a taboo, that person is often considered objectionable by society as a whole. A list of things that have generally been considered taboo include, but is not limited to, such things as adultery, bigotry, abortion, blood transfusions, adultery, polygamy, homosexuality, abortion, incest, cannibalism, bestiality, masturbation, matricide, patricide, infanticide, murder, pedophilia, necrophilia, pornography, slavery, and suicide. And that's just to name a few. However, if you're a fan of podcasts or you happen to be in the business of creating one, you find yourself talking about topics you normally wouldn't talk about at the water cooler or at the copy machine if that were the case. Because podcasts quite often discuss topics that are taboo, I'm going to talk about one today. I talk about subjects that are taboo all the time. Just last week, we finished up my story out of Cleveland, Michelle, Amanda, and Gina, women kidnapped and essentially kept as slaves. The week before that, we spoke of infanticide in the case of Vincent Brothers, and before that, pedophilia in the case of Richard Allen Davis. I've managed to sidestep some topics I would have a hard time talking about, things like necrophilia and cannibalism. I don't really like researching or talking about stuff like that, but maybe someday I'll find a story that includes those topics and I may want to tell it. One just hasn't really jumped out at me quite yet. There are some topics I avoid talking about altogether here with you, namely religion and politics. Politics seems to always start arguments, even if everyone talking has similar views and opinions. I see it all the time. For example, at the dog park specifically is where I see it. They're like a gang. They get there at the same time, they set up their chairs in a circle, and they do talk about all sorts of stuff, but inevitably it leads to politics. Then things sometimes escalate pretty quickly. Typically I'll nonchalantly migrate away from it, pretend my dog pooped or something. Politics can get people riled up, and I just as soon avoid the subject altogether. Everyone's entitled to their opinions, so talking about them with other people who are more likely than not are going to have a different opinion is probably not going to lead to a friendly conversation. It's probably going to be tense. and it's going to be frustrating. And bringing those dynamics to a social setting unnecessarily is just going to make everything uncomfortable. And if you do it on purpose, it gets kind of rude if you know that you might instigate an argument. Same goes for religion, and often it can be even worse than trying to talk politics. People fight wars, people kill one another, all in the name of religion. But some things are just best left out of the conversation. Like I said, everyone is entitled to have their own set of beliefs. Everyone has that right. But there is no reason for it to be the main topic of discussion in general, if not for any other reason than just as a precaution. Like I said, people lose their lives over religious conflict. You never know who's listening, and if someone you don't know that well hears you speaking about your religious beliefs, and they harbor extremely negative feelings about them, you never know what can happen. I steer clear of those topics all across social media, and there's no reason for me to push any kind of political or religious agenda onto anyone who comes to listen to this show each week, considering many of you may be trying to get away from that stuff, at least for an hour or so. Besides, I don't really have an agenda, so we're good. But today, I am going to talk religion, just a little bit, because it plays a role in the story I'm going to tell. Oftentimes when you hear a true crime story, you might come to find that person who committed the crime may have seemed the unlikeliest of persons to have done such a thing. Like, for example, Vincent Brothers in episode 27, the elementary school vice principal convicted of killing his entire family. While other times, it comes as no surprise that a person escalated their crimes to the point that they ended up on a podcast, like the murderer of Polly Klaas. He's one who would be the likeliest of persons to have done such a thing. Throughout his life, he never tried to hide the fact that he was a criminal and a predator. Today's story involves one of those types of people who appeared, for all intents and purposes, the most unlikeliest of people, one who actively practiced the taboo of polygamy, but then to go on to commit the ultimate sin of murder, all the while hiding behind a veil of devout religion. In today's episode of California Dreaming, the tale of the minister and his wives. Joy Risker grew up in the San Diego area of California. Her mother and her father split when she was very young, and she would have little contact with her father. She was raised an only child by her single mom, Gwen, in a modest neighborhood. There could not have been a more fitting name for Joy, as she was always a happy child. She was outgoing, vibrant, free-spirited, and people were always drawn to her. All of her friends and loved ones described her as beautiful, inside and out, and so much fun to be around. Growing up, life for Gwen and Joy was kind of tough. They didn't have a lot of money, and they didn't have a lot of material things. Mom struggled to make ends meet, but Joy and her mother, they had each other, and they were very, very close, the best of friends. Despite the close and loving relationship Joy had with her mom, she did miss her dad a great deal. She missed having him around, and she missed the dynamics of a home that was a whole family with both parents. She longed for the feeling of a big, loving family, and that was a void in Joy's life as she was growing up. When Joy was 15, looking for something to maybe fill that void, she joined a local church. She was in search of a sense of community, a sense of belonging, along with a spiritual home. She was a very spiritual person, and she was seeking a mentor for guidance and inspiration. She seemed to have found what she was looking for when she joined the church's youth group. She found friends, and she also found the person who would become her youth pastor. In 1994, Sean Goff was an evangelical minister at a church that Joy attended. He was 26 years old and Joy was 16 when they met and he became her youth pastor. He was very charismatic and charming, not to mention good-looking and deeply religious. He was incredibly good at what he was doing, spreading the word of his faith. He was preaching at churches all over San Diego, and he was also becoming widely known as the preacher for the ministry of Dr. Morris Cerullo, a Christian Pentecostal televangelist with a worldwide following who hosts the Victory Today television program. He was beginning to get some airtime on Dr. Cerullo's show as the Master of Ceremonies, and this was broadcasted all over the world. Goff was really beginning to make a name for himself as a preacher. He was captivating and inspiring, and Joy was very much drawn in. When he would be speaking, Joy hung on every single word, completely enthralled with everything he said. She grew to become extremely attracted to Goff, this man of God, someone she felt that she had been looking for and wanting, someone to guide her on her spiritual journey. And as for Goff, he took an interest in Joy as well, and over time, he took her under his wing, taking on a very trusting role in her life as her mentor. Goff mentored lots of young people as a youth pastor. Anyone he involved himself with, he was always willing to reach out and to provide guidance. He was very helpful and very kind, but with Joy, he was different. His interest in her was markedly different. He made her feel incredibly special with all of the attention he gave her. This could very well be what she had been longing for, what she'd been missing in her life at home. That father figure type of person that wasn't there. I'm speculating this, of course, but it seems to make sense based on what friends and loved ones would describe as what Joy had longed for since her father was out of the picture. As the relationship between Joy and Goff continued to flourish, he began to invite her over to his home for Bible studies, as well as to spend time with him, his newborn son, and his wife of 5 years, Sheila. Sheila was described as a type of wife who was submissive to her husband. She was the homemaker. She was quiet and kept to herself, and she never really had a lot to say. Joy loved the feeling of family when she went over to the Goff home, and she was there a lot. She began to consider Goff and Sheila as a second family. As time passed, Joy began to develop deeper feelings for Goff. I think this could be best described as a teenage crush. And as for Goff, he enjoyed the attention of women, and he was enjoying the attention that he was getting from a young, beautiful Joy. Some would say Sean was able to charm Joy with his looks, his smile, and his charisma, but either way, Joy was in love. And when she graduated from high school in 1996, he began to want to become more involved with Joy. He spent more time with her. He gave her almost all of his attention. Joy began to hope that Goff's feelings for her were beginning to grow, despite the fact that he's 10 years her senior and already had a wife and a young son. That wasn't stopping her feelings from becoming stronger and stronger with each passing day. And the fact that he was married with a child wasn't going to stop him either. At this point, some men would put the brakes on the budding relationship and stick with their marriage they're committed to. Others may cave into the temptations of a young, lovely woman such as Joy, while still others may opt for a divorce so he would be able to move on with his new relationship that he's interested in pursuing. Any of those, while maybe not always the best decisions, are some of the typical ways that things go when something like this happens to one of the partners in a marriage. But not Sean Goff. He wasn't going to cheat, but he wasn't going to divorce, and he certainly wasn't going to walk away from Joy. His solution to this conundrum? To be married to both of them. In his mind, Sheila can be wife number 1, and Joy can be wife number 2. Problem solved. I can't stand those terms, wife 1 and wife 2, so I'm not even going to label these women as such. They are Sheila and Joy, and if you already couldn't tell, they're very young and very impressionable when they cross paths with this Sean Goff guy. So Goff made this proposal to Joy, and she is taken aback by what he's asking, for her to marry him and to be a sister wife with Sheila. I don't like that word either, by the way. I just don't really know how else to describe this stuff. This goes against everything that Joy believes in, deeply believes in. He explains to her that ever since he was a child, he secretly believed in polygamy and wanted to have that for himself. Now, most mainstream Christians do not support the idea of polygamy, and many people tend to associate the practice of polygamy with the Mormon religion, but it isn't exactly exclusive to that religion alone. There are many religious groups that practice it. There are Christian polygamists who are quite conservative, quite God-fearing individuals. However, those who advocate for polygamy point out that God said it was okay in the Old Testament. Many men in the Bible had more than one wife, and Goff used this in convincing Joy. He told her that polygamy was God's plan for mankind, and that it was God's plan for them. He also convinced her by telling her that Sheila would warmly welcome her into the family with open arms. Don't worry. If you rolled your eyes right now, you're not wrong. Goff was using Joy's weaknesses against her in order to draw her into this idea, using religion, family, and the feelings that she had for him. This was going to be easy for him to manipulate her into accepting his plans for this plural marriage. Besides, he had basically done the same thing to Sheila. She too had met Goff when he was her youth pastor. She was young and vulnerable, but also in love with this man who had been her spiritual guide and religious leader as well. So he sat down with her to tell her about this revelation God made to him, that God wanted him to bring another woman into the family. Whatever feelings she had about this idea, she pushed them aside and agreed to the arrangement, because in her mind, this is what God would have wanted her to do. Joy had never in her life considered sharing a husband with another woman, and neither did the church that they were members of. Goff had belonged to a non-denominational Christian church, and polygamy was most certainly frowned upon, as well as it is by most of society. And besides, the state of California does not allow for more than one legal marriage, so because the practice is basically unacceptable and not to mention illegal, Christian polygamists are forced to exist covertly as a part of an underground network, a secret society of sorts. Joy would have to hide the fact that she was married to Goff. She was resistant, but he was persuasive. He kept telling her, in order to convince her that this is what God would want, this was his plan. And not only that, it would finally be a way for Joy to have everything she ever wanted, a family. Goff was able to give her everything, a stable home, a built-in family, everything she had ever dreamed of. She could fill those voids that had been plaguing her since her mother and father split. Joy was only going to be able to hold out for so long. She was very vulnerable and very impressionable, and she was very much in love with this man. She finally caved in and accepted his proposal for marriage. Convinced she had found her true love, Joy shared the news of her engagement, but with only a few very close friends and her mom. As you could have guessed, Joy's mom was strongly opposed to the idea of Joy being a part of a polygamist marriage. Just like Joy, her mother was devoutly religious and felt that there was no part of this that was okay by any means. So it stunned Joy's friends when her mother actually gave Joy her blessings. But they understood her mom's decision. They knew she didn't want to drive a wedge between herself and her daughter. Joy was pretty much set, and that this was what she wanted to do, and her mother knew that trying to stop her was only going to alienate Joy from her. So she went along. In 1997, when Joy was 19 years old, she married Goff in a small beachside ceremony in San Diego. Of course, the marriage was not legally binding. They made a covenant before God and entered into what would be termed as a spiritual or biblical marriage. So in the technical sense of the word, Goff was not a bigamist, at least not according to California law. He had not applied for a license to become legally married to Joy, nor did he do so in any other state. If he had applied for a license in another state and obtained it and participated in a legally recognized wedding ceremony, then he would be considered a bigamist. So Goff was not legally married to Joy, but in his mind, he viewed his marriage to Sheila and his marriage to Joy exactly the same way. To him, there was no difference. In the summer of 1997, Joy would move into the Goff home and settle into her new life as the newest wife of Sean Goff. A ready-made family built right in. By all accounts, Joy was completely content with this arrangement, with herself, Sheila, and their husband. She settled in quickly, and they started working out arrangements around the home, sharing chores, sharing childcare, sharing Goff. And they did everything they could to make sure that nobody in their circle of friends, neighbors, or acquaintances would find out about the plural marriage. All the neighbors knew Goff. They knew he was a well-known pastor at the local church. They also knew Sheila and her son. So everyone was under the impression that Joy was their nanny. I don't know how Joy felt about this, having to hide her marriage to the man that she loved from the entire world. Of course, this could not go on forever. Asking Joy to keep their marriage a secret was a huge sacrifice Joy was willing to make, but only for some time. She would go on to find out that there were going to have to be more and more sacrifices Goff was going to want her to make for the sake of the family, and it was simply going to become too much. Something was going to have to give, and Joy did not seem the type of person that was going to be held down or held back from living the life that she would eventually want to live. As for Goff, the man could not be more pleased with himself. This lifelong dream to practice polygamy had finally come true for him, and he was proud of the fact that he had himself 2 wives. He was particularly pleased with his new wife, Joy. She was beautiful, young, and vibrant. She was exciting and fun, and she was the one that he wanted to take out, and he wanted to show her off. She was like a prize to him, a shiny new wife. And he does. He does take her out, and he does show her off. But he also wants to remain discreet whenever they are out in public so nobody will recognize him. Remember, Goff is a rising star as a preacher, and he definitely feared losing everything he has tried to build up for himself if anyone were to find out about his 2 wives. The church that they belonged to, the congregation that he preached to, would be appalled and shocked if they knew. Of course, polygamy is being practiced, but they aren't exactly advertising it. But it is a very, very real, yet very hidden part of the subculture. And Joy is willing to adapt to it for the sake of their marriage and Goff's career. Besides, she's completely satisfied with all of the attention that Goff pays her instead of Sheila. And Sheila is not adjusting well to the new arrangements with Joy in the picture, which I could very easily see happening. I mean, why would she be? Her husband's paying all of his attention to Joy. I can't imagine that feels good. And at the beginning, things were rough. Joy and Sheila were not getting along at all. Goff eventually stepped in and asserted himself as the head of the household and took control over the entire situation. He let them know, like it or not, this is the way things were going to be, and they needed to get along and to do something to figure this out. In his mind, it is required of him to be the leader of the family, that it's God's will for him to have and maintain total authority over the home, which includes the wives as well, that women are subservient, that they need to be told and taught, and his word was gospel. Now, as we take a moment to collectively roll our eyes, I want to say that I do not have to tell you that this guy has taken these archaic ideas way too far. And I don't think it can be emphasized enough how ridiculous this all sounds now. And this was some 20 years ago when she married that guy. And I really doubt that there is anyone listening who really thinks otherwise, so I'm likely preaching to the choir. See what I did there? Right, okay. I know I'm not that funny. So, anyway, Goff's influence over his wives was very powerful. And eventually, Joy and Sheila came to the conclusion that if they were going to want to hang on to this life that he is providing for them, they are going to have to submit. They set aside their differences and work on getting along with one another. The upshot in all of this is that it would eventually work in their favor as they forged this camaraderie. What I love and appreciate about these women is they would not allow themselves to be held to these standards forever. Not only that, they would rise above it, or at least they would try. Goff's control over the home began to intensify over time. He had to have a hand in every single decision that was made, up to and including the sleeping arrangements. He had a detailed schedule as to who was going to spend the night with who. He would go back and forth between Joy's room and Sheila's room as he saw fit. This was something Goff struggled with as a devoutly religious person: desire. He was either going to have to rid himself of his desires or indulge them, and he chose the latter. His appetite was insatiable. And it wasn't just the sleeping arrangements and their sex lives that he controlled. He controlled everything. He took charge of all the finances and gave Sheila and Joy allowances, as if they were like children. You know, as I was reading this, I couldn't help but think back to the last 2 episodes about the Cleveland kidnapper. By no means was this arrangement with Joy and Sheila anything close to as awful as that. But in looking at Goff's narcissistic personality, doesn't it remind you a little bit of Castro's? The controlling and manipulative behaviors? And it gets worse. There's going to be more about this so-called man of God that's going to mirror many of the personality traits of an abundance of criminals you've heard of covered by podcasts. And because we hear about these stories on podcasts, we know these things usually don't end well. Unfortunately for Goff, rumors began swirling about his relationship with Joy and Sheila, and soon word got back to where he works at Maura Cirillo's ministry that he was an underground polygamist. This was deeply concerning to the ministry. Having this polygamist basically running the show on his worldwide televangelist show could be very, very damaging to their reputation. After confronting him with the allegations and having to disclose that the rumors were indeed true, Goff was forced to resign from this prominent position he held at the ministry. And it wasn't only his job that he lost. He lost friendships and relationships within the community that didn't want to be associated with someone who had essentially been preaching about one thing to the world, and I guess was not practicing what he preached is the best way to describe it, behind the scenes in his own personal life. This was a devastating blow to the career that he was trying to build for himself as a spiritual leader. But he wasn't going to let losing this coveted job get him down. Because, he thinks so highly of himself. If the mainstream church wasn't going to be welcoming to his lifestyle choices, then he was just going to have to create a ministry for Christian polygamists of his own, make his own rules, and find people he could preach to who would follow him. So where does one turn when looking for a group of polygamists looking for a spiritual leader? The internet, of course. He searched and found a network of underground Christian polygamists who interacted with one another in an online blog and chat forum. He began to reach out to those who expressed an interest in the polygamous lifestyle in order to try and build an online congregation to preach to. And just as charismatic and influential as he was in person, he was just as much so online as well. He touted his family, Joy, Sheila, and his son as the perfect example of a polygamist relationship functioning normally. And what was going to make this perfect plural marriage even more perfect? Joy becoming pregnant. For Joy, everything that she had ever dreamed of was coming true. But if you were to ask her friends and loved ones, they'd say that getting Joy, and Sheila previously pregnant, was one of his manipulative moves. And so with the news of Joy's pregnancy, Goff decided that it was time to step up his preaching game to the next level. It was time for him to start arranging for some in-person get-togethers. He would organize these retreats, I guess is what you could call them, where he would push his polygamist ideology to those in attendance. He brought his wives with him to show them off like his props for the production that he was putting on. And of course, those aspiring for this lifestyle, they were impressed. They looked up to him, and they wanted to be him. And before long, Goff was their new leader, back on his path to being the preacher with a whole new set of followers that he did not have to hide from. And the fact that they bought what he was selling inflated the guy's ego that much more. In June of 2000, Joy gave birth to a baby boy named Stone. However, in a sad twist, a few days after her son was born, her mother died, which devastated her. Her mom was her only family outside of Goff and Sheila, and there was never going to be anyone else to turn to once her mother was gone. And then fast forward to 2 years later, Joy gave birth to a second son that she named Onyx. Of course, Joy was over the moon with the arrival of another child. Anyone who knew her would say she loved her boys. They were everything to her, and Joy was a fabulous mom. But with more mouths to feed, money was tight. So it was decided that Sheila would go back to work to help supplement the income. And you can pretty much guess what Joy would be doing. She was the nanny, of course. And do you think that this is what Joy had in mind? Free-spirited, effervescent, outgoing Joy? To stay home and watch kids for who knows how long? Joy had dreams. She had aspirations. Yes, she wanted the family. Yes, she wanted the home. Of course, she wanted the children. But she also wanted to go to college, expand her mind and her world. She did not want to be limited to this. Sadly for Joy, she had chased her dreams in kind of the wrong order. She jumped into being married with children practically right out of high school. And as soon as she found herself babysitting 3 kids, and that was pretty much going to be the extent of her existence, she began to feel trapped, even suffocated. I really can't speak from experience. I only had 1 kid, and when she was 2, I was fortunate enough to land a job teaching pre-K, and I was able to bring her with me. But I've had plenty of friends and acquaintances who lose their sense of self, and sometimes their sense of self-worth, when they take on the role of stay-at-home parent. And if you are one or you were one of those, then you could probably relate to how Joy was feeling. Maybe not exactly because, polygamy, but you get my point. So Joy told Goff that she wanted to go to college. She wanted to have a career, and she wanted to go to work. But he shut her down right away, telling her that it was not going to happen. Her educational and career goals were not a part of his master plan. He told her she's got these kids and she has to stay home. She was disappointed at Goff's lack of support in seeing her reach some of her personal goals. But at this point, she really doesn't feel like she has a choice. She was trapped, just the way Goff wanted it. And for now, she was just going to have to obey the orders of her husband. As time went on, Joy began to notice some disturbing things about Goff, if there already weren't enough. He had started becoming abusive and degrading, not to her, but to Sheila. She was the target of his temper and his rage. Doesn't this sound like a certain Cleveland kidnapper we're familiar with? According to Joy's friends whom she confided in, He criticized everything about Sheila. He'd complain about her weight. He'd make her stand on a scale and degrade her for it. He psychologically tormented her, and she was terrified of him, and to an extent, so was Joy, even though she wasn't the target of his abuse. And the more his behavior escalated, the more they felt as though they needed to protect themselves from him. And what happened was quite interesting. Joy and Sheila, once opposed to each other's existence in the relationship, they seemed to forge an alliance, and together they turned against their husband. And they did the only thing that they could: take away the one thing that they had control over. They refused him sex. And when they did that, the balance of power shifted in the home in their favor. However, Goff was not going to stand for this threat to his control and his hold over the household. If they were going to play this game, he was going to have to answer back. And how do you think he was going to do that? If you guessed bring a third wife home, then you would be correct. Goff told Sheila and Joy that it has come time for him to take on a third wife, that he had a calling from God and it was his will. They really had no say in the matter. Goff was in charge of the household and what he says goes. So he began looking online for a third wife to bring into the home. And it seems that it was fairly easy for him to do so. There are dedicated websites for those interested in practicing polygamy. And he looked until he found a 23-year-old from Maryland named Becky. She quickly accepted the invitation to come and join Goff's family in San Diego, and so he flew to Maryland and brought her home. Joy and Sheila weren't too keen on having a stranger suddenly living in their home with their children, but again, they have to put their own feelings aside in order to appease Goff. And their concerns were for good reasons. From day one, Becky was a nightmare to have in the home. It quickly became apparent that she struggled with mental illness. She appeared to have multiple personalities with individual names, and Goff addressed her by the various names. And the ever-narcissistic Goff thinks that he can somehow fix her problems. How, you ask? Well, to him, she's obviously possessed by the devil, so he attempted several exorcism rituals, but it hadn't worked. And her presence in the home was making everyone stressed and anxious. So after about a month, Goff sent her packing. I guess the exorcisms didn't work. The good thing was that she was gone, but the downside was Goff seemed to view this as a failure on his part, and that reflected poorly on him. And his idea of fixing the problems that he had with Sheila and Joy by bringing Becky didn't work. So his only solution was to dial up his control over his wives. Everything they did had to be approved by him. Every place they went, anybody they saw, anyone that they talked to, even down to what they wore. This was not going to be something Joy would be willing to comply with for very long. By the time she was 25, she began standing up to Goff. She wasn't the same woman who married that man 6 years earlier. She had matured. She had children now, and she wasn't going to be submissive to this man for the rest of her life. And her first act of defiance, she enrolled in college. She began to pursue the education that she had been wanting for so long by then. She had started socializing with her friends again. And I don't know if any of you out there listening have ever been in a controlling relationship, but a very, very long time ago, I once was, and you definitely lose touch with your friends. People you never thought you'd want to be without. You suddenly find yourself without them. And sometimes you don't even realize it's happening at the time. You just one day wake up and your entire circle of friends is gone. And my experience was before social media, and in some ways I'm kind of glad it was. Anyway, this is about Joy. So the more she gravitates towards her friends, the more tight-fisted Goff becomes of her. He begins to start accusing her of cheating on him, typical of a controlling partner. And the more he suffocates her, the further and further away she's pulling from him. She begins to start thinking of ways to try and get out of this marriage. Her plan was to move out and get a job, continue her education, and do the best she could at raising her boys. So, in the fall of 2003, Joy let Goff know that she was leaving him. But you can probably guess that he was not going to make that easy for her. Not in the least. He threatened her with the one thing that he knew that meant the most to her: the kids. He told her that if she left, he'd take away the kids. This was her biggest fear, so she was going to have to do what she needed to do to keep the situation from becoming any more volatile until she was able to figure out what she was going to do. She did so by playing it off like everything was okay. But in reality, she was preparing to leave him. Goff began trying to win back Joy's affections. After all, she was once deeply in love with the man. But you know and I know people grow up. They mature and they change and they evolve, and Joy was no different. But to Goff, Joy leaving would have been a terrible blow to his overblown ego. He built his brand new ministry on the foundation of polygamist ideals. He and his 2 wives were the perfect example of a successful, happy plural marriage. And if Joy were to leave him, it would reflect so badly upon him. And how would that look to his congregation of followers? He wasn't about to let Joy leave. A few weeks after Joy had announced that she was no longer wanting to be a part of this marriage arrangement, she was surprised when Goff invited her for a romantic night out at the Hotel del Coronado, his favorite place to get away but still stay in town. He even made arrangements for Sheila and the 3 boys to take a road trip to Santa Barbara so that he would be able to have some alone time with Joy. On Saturday, September 19th, 2003, sometime after 8 p.m. that evening while she and Goff were having dinner, Joy called Sheila to check in on how the boys were doing and to say goodnight. Sheila would later describe Joy sounding very happy in that conversation that they had had during that phone call. That would be the last time anyone ever heard from Joy. On September 21st, Goff suddenly phoned Sheila. He was hysterical as he explained to her that he and Joy got into a huge fight and that she walked out on him and the boys in order to be with a new boyfriend. He would relate the same story to all of Joy's friends, and he appeared to them to be devastated that she had left him. But the odd thing about all of this was Joy didn't tell any of her friends that she was leaving. And she had a big circle of very close friends, and it wasn't like her to not tell them what her plans were. She was always very open and honest with her friends, and they knew she'd been having some troubles in her marriage and was looking for a way out. But for her to not contact anyone was troubling, and they worried about their friend. A couple of weeks had gone by and her friends had grown deeply concerned about her. Goff began reaching out to them because they were relentless in trying to get in touch with her. He told them all the same story, that she walked out on him and the kids. He was worried sick, but he didn't know what to do. As more time passed, everyone was becoming increasingly troubled that they weren't hearing from Joy. Just about the only person who wasn't all that concerned, it seems, was Sheila. According to people who knew them, she really wasn't all that upset about Joy being gone, which I guess is kind of understandable. I don't know if she believed Goff's story or not, but I do think she was trying to be the dutiful wife, staying focused on taking care of the 3 kids herself. What Joy's friends were hoping for was that the worst case scenario was that she was hiding from Goff's controlling and abusive behavior and is secretly working on a way to get her kids back from him safely. But time was going by and there was still no word from Joy. Her friends just knew that she wouldn't want to be away from her kids like this. Suddenly, her friends began receiving emails from her, much to their relief. Joy explained to them that she had left town and to stop worrying about her, she's finding herself. Of course, they emailed back offering her help, particularly help with getting her kids. But the responses they were getting back really didn't sound like Joy. Her emails were succinct. They didn't actually sound like the Joy they knew. They almost had an angry tone, demanding that her friends leave her alone. Joy very much lived up to her name, like I said in the beginning. She was never angry in any facet of her life, and this was not sitting well with her friends receiving these types of correspondences from her. Soon, they stopped hearing from Joy at all. They had had enough. They contacted the San Diego Sheriff's Department and reported her missing. The first stop for investigators was the Goff home. Sean retold the same story. She just up and left, ran off with the new boyfriend, and he had no idea where she was or how to get in touch with her. Sheila related the same thing. She hasn't seen or heard from Joy and has no knowledge or information as to her whereabouts. Investigators are uncertain of their story. They are definitely suspicious of Goff, but what about Sheila? Is it possible that she's hiding something? They couldn't help but wonder. In looking for any potential clues, investigators searched Goff's home, but nothing really seemed out of the ordinary. But when they were making their way to what would have been Joy's room, they did find it to be completely empty, as if Joy was never there. That kind of struck them as odd. So they questioned Goff about it, and he explained that he was so angry that she left him that he got rid of all of her belongings. He wanted to forget about her. Nothing he said investigators were buying, but they didn't have anything to really go on for the time being, so they were going to have to walk away. But they were going to keep a close eye on Goff to see what he might do next. The suspicion of Goff had reached a fever pitch. Joy's friends were constantly contacting him, demanding to know what he did with her. Investigators were as well. They were not going to let up. They could see that the pressure was getting to him. He became very stressed. He began asking friends to pray for him. He started losing a lot of weight. The man was a mess. I doubt he was stressing over what happened to Joy, but rather what was going to happen to him. How long could he keep these secrets? Not very long, it seems. 1 month after Joy was last heard from, Goff walked into the San Diego County Jail. He had something he needed to say. He sat down with detectives and began to spill the beans. He told them that Joy had not run off with a secret boyfriend, that, in fact, he had killed her. They said, "Okay, so you've come down here to turn yourself in for murder." He immediately countered that he did not murder her, he killed her. He wanted to make that distinction very clear. He knew, and the investigators knew, that killing someone and murdering someone is not the same thing. They tried asking him where the location of Joy's body was, and he refused, telling them that he wasn't sure that he should answer that question at that time. He also stonewalled them about the details. They wanted to know how and when she died, but he remained tight-lipped. Goff had been living with the stress and anxiety over what had happened, but to me, it seems like he was spending that time carefully calculating this moment that he was going to walk into the county jail and announce that he had killed Joy. He was careful about what he was saying. He was careful not to incriminate himself. He was careful to not give away too much. All of this was in the interest of securing his defense for a potential trial. The ever-manipulative Sean Goff. He soon requested the presence of an attorney, and so the interrogation abruptly came to an end. So Goff was arrested and booked on murder charges. He was going to have to remain in jail until his trial, as he was unable to make bail. Word soon spread to Joy's friends and loved ones as to what Goff had confessed to, as well as to his friends and his congregation. They were in complete disbelief that he had done this. This man of God, supposedly. How was this possible? And of course, they were deeply saddened by the fact that they now know they were never going to see Joy again. But there's still this question of what in the world did he do with her? Without her body, investigators were in a tough position to try and prove murder had taken place. They were able to hold him on some obstruction of justice charges because he was withholding the information that would lead investigators to Joy's location. No body cases are really hard to prove. There's always a chance Goff could recant his confession. They'd have to prove that she is indeed dead and not off somewhere living a new life. And without a body, they are going to have trouble proving how she died. So investigators are just going to have to search whatever evidence they can find that can help prove that not only was Joy deceased, but also a murder took place. They return back to the Goff house, where they find Sheila there with the kids, and she consented to a second search of the home, but this time looking for evidence that might not be visible to the naked eye, such as blood splatter. And sure enough, using an alternative light source, investigators find traces of blood splatter on the walls of Joy's bedroom. It would later be DNA tested and determined to be Joy's blood. They wanted to get more information from Sheila because they were convinced that she knew more than she was letting on. She finally decided that she cannot keep quiet about what she knows any longer. She describes the phone call from Goff that he had made to her a month earlier when she was driving back from that road trip he had sent her on that weekend when Joy went missing. He told her that when she got home, she was going to find blood in the house. He explained to her that they had gotten into a fight and Joy was injured, and that's when she took off. He didn't give her many more details than that, but he told her to clean up the blood when she got home. So she did as she was told. Sheila explained to detectives that she did not know that Joy was dead, but they still needed to get to the bottom of this and see if she had any involvement in Joy's death, because Goff sure wasn't saying anything. They would eventually come to the conclusion that Sheila did not have any knowledge or any involvement in what happened to Joy, so they refocused on getting their case put together against Goff. At the top of their to-do list was to try and figure out where Goff left Joy. Where is she? She's got to be out there somewhere. So the first thing they did was enter Joy's DNA into the CODIS database, the Combined DNA Index System, to see if a match could be found there. They really couldn't establish where Goff had been during the time Joy had gone missing and Sheila was in Santa Barbara. The case was pretty weak, and authorities did not think they could prove a murder with no body, no murder weapon, no method of homicide, and no real solid motive. There's just nothing to prove a murder took place. But that would all change 2 months later, and 300 miles away, in the Arizona desert, underneath a Palo Verde tree. In January of 2004, a hunter in the Arizona desert noticed a bizarre mound of stones meticulously stacked in what appeared to have been possibly a Native American burial site of some sort. The hunter was amazed by the size of the rock piles. It was 6 feet high and 6 feet in diameter. I'll post pictures of the stone pile on social media after this episode is up. The hunter inspects the pile of stones, thinking that there's something buried underneath those rocks. And as he came closer to it, he noticed there was also a putrid odor emanating from it as well. And it didn't smell like an animal. And he really didn't think anyone would go through this much trouble as to pile up these rocks in this shrine-like manner for just an animal. He was thinking something more sinister might be buried under there. So he called his son, who conveniently was a federal ranger with the Bureau of Land Management. He came out there to inspect the area, which was a fairly popular hunting spot. The pile of rocks was located about 9 miles off the interstate, and required them to travel off-road for some distance. And the way these rocks were placed behind that Palo Verde tree, it obscured them from anyone traveling along the road. He began to take the rock pile apart, one stone at a time. Within a few minutes, and a few rocks having been removed, he could see what appeared to be a human leg, as well as hair that looked like the hair of a woman. The person who was found under those rocks was sent to the Maricopa County Forensic Anthropologist Lab. She was mostly skeleton, with some portions of her mummified, with some tissue still remaining on her legs and feet. They could also see that she had dreadlocks that were about 10 inches in length. The forensic anthropologist was able to determine from examining the remains that she was an African American female in her 20s who had given birth at least one time. Some of the next part of the story involves the state in which the remains of the person were discovered, and it's pretty graphic. So, it was also determined that the cause of death was multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma to the neck, face, and chest, as it could be seen that some of the rib bones had been cut by a sharp object, and there were no injuries to the arms, indicating that there wasn't very much of an attempt to ward off the attack. In an effort to conceal this woman's identity, her fingers were manually sawed off. Her face was smashed in with the blunt object, and her upper and lower jaw was removed. So there in Arizona, it did not seem that this woman matched anyone in their missing persons database. And with fingerprint and dental identification impossible, they were going to have to figure out a different way to identify the woman. They did commission a forensic artist to try and make a composite sketch of what she may have looked like in life, although they didn't have any part of her jaw to work with, and the bones in the face had been smashed as well. And so they did what they could with what they had, and once that sketch was done, it was circulated through the local media and on the internet, hoping to bring about some leads as to her identity. But it did not seem anyone in Arizona knew who this woman was. Her DNA was entered into CODIS, and it took 8 months, but investigators in San Diego finally got a hit. The DNA from the woman under the rocks in Arizona matched the DNA of the blood they found at the crime scene in the Goff home. This was the break they needed to finally bring their case against Goff to trial, because now it was official. Joy was dead, and she was the victim of a homicide. Prosecutors were ready to take their murder case against Sean Goff to trial. It was their theory that after that romantic dinner they had had at the Hotel del Coronado, they had returned home, and that's when Goff attacked Joy, stabbing her in the chest and torso. Prosecutors saw this as a cold-blooded, premeditated plan to kill Joy because he would not allow her to leave him. He demanded complete control over her life, and Goff was going to make sure of that. Prosecutors would describe Goff as one of the scariest men out there, the kind of evil that's able to hide behind the veil of religion. The forensic pathologist who examined Joy came in from Arizona to testify. She described in graphic details the things that had been done to Joy's body, not just in killing her, but the mutilation that took place post-mortem. She stated based on the knife damage to the ribs and to the sternum that Joy had suffered stab wounds directly into the heart, and after she was killed, she was mutilated. There was an attempt to damage Joy's face to the point that she would not be recognized. She found a tool mark on Joy's hyoid bone that appeared to have been made by a saw-type instrument, and insinuated that it appeared to be an attempt to decapitate Joy, but he was unable to complete the task. So in a gruesome attempt to conceal her identity, Goff sawed off her fingertips, along with her upper and lower jaw. And according to prosecutors, this was certainly no spontaneous act. This was not an event that took place in the heat of the moment or a crime of passion. and the prosecutor had some bone-chilling evidence to prove that Goff had been systematically preparing for Joy's murder for quite some time, at least since the time he knew that Joy was going to leave him, and there was no convincing her to change her mind. He was not going to let her or the kids go. One of Goff's friends, who was a writer, took the stand and testified about a meeting they had had a year prior to Joy's murder. He stated that Goff was interested in working on a storyline for a book, possibly even a movie. And when this friend was asked what the topics they had been discussing were, he described it as the story would be centered around this antagonist, who would watch and study investigative-type television shows in order to try and learn how to commit the perfect murder, including the best methods of hiding a body. The prosecutor asked if there had been any talk about trying to find a place to put a body where it would never be found, and he indicated there had been talks about that. The antagonist would find ideas from television shows like the FBI files, forensic files, and the like. Even more damning, his friend testified that several weeks before Joy's death, that Goff had foreshadowed a motive for murder by saying that things were not working out with Joy and that she was lazy and sloppy, and he was going to have to somehow get rid of her. He stated that Goff told him that he was dissatisfied with Joy and had some plans for her, and that her time was running out. He was giving her 2 or 3 weeks max to shape up or ship out. Joy's friends testified and corroborated one another when they stated that Goff was always one to let it be known that if Joy were to ever leave him, he was keeping the kids. His exact words being, he would not allow her to have the kids. They also said that they heard Goff say stuff like Joy was the kind of person who would take off and leave and never look back again. To them, this sounded like he was laying the foundation for her to suddenly be gone. And friends knew Joy wasn't the type of person to shut them out and walk away without a word. They would never have believed that. And what about those emails her friends had received? Well, everyone obviously knew by then that they didn't come from her, but they knew that when they received them and that they didn't sound anything like their friend. She would have never been so terse and angry sounding with them. Investigators who had seized Goff's computer determined through forensic analysis that those emails originated from him, part of this elaborate cover-up of his. Sheila Goff took the stand, his first wife, and likely the one witness who knew the defendant better than anyone. She had married him when she was a teenager, just like Joy, and now divorced, she was called to testify on behalf of the prosecution against her ex-husband. Of course, there were questions as to why did she decide to go along with Goff's demands for a plural marriage. She stated that she didn't feel like she had a choice because she was convinced that this was what God wanted her to do. She also related that she felt like she might lose her relationship with Goff, and in turn, lose her son as well, and she didn't want that to happen. She was also able to shed some light on some of Goff's activities leading up to that September day Joy was murdered. For example, there were some peculiar purchases Goff had made 6 days prior to Joy's disappearance. A chisel, a handsaw, a pickaxe, a sledgehammer, duct tape, plastic sheeting, a shovel, a cooler, a butcher block, and a butcher knife. The prosecutor asked Sheila if her ex-husband was a handy kind of guy, someone who has hobbies that include woodwork. She said no. Plumbing? No. Landscaping? No. And what would she describe his skills as a handyman? She said none. So what did all these tools mean? The prosecutor would be the first to tell you. Those are the items Goff obtained in order to make his own murder and dismemberment kit. And that weekend, he arranged for Sheila and the kids to take that road trip to Santa Barbara, and that is when he put his plans in motion. Part of his plan was to get Joy to let her guard down by taking her to his favorite place to dine, at a very pricey restaurant in the Hotel del Coronado, where they dined on a $229 meal consisting of the main course, Kobe beef. Sheila testified that Joy called her a little after 8:30 to say goodnight to the boys, and according to Sheila, she seemed happy. The prosecutor pressed her. Did she sound angry? No. Did she sound upset? No. Distressed? No. She seemed perfectly fine, not someone who was about to fly into a rage and fight to the death with Goff. That call was the last anyone ever heard from Joy. They went home, and he killed her, in her bedroom. He took her to the bathroom where he did the rest of the mutilation, smashing her face, sawing off of her fingers and her jaw. Then he took her and placed her in a large container and placed that into the back of an SUV that he had rented. He knew he'd be off-roading. He made that 5-hour drive to the Arizona desert, placed her body under that Palo Verde tree. Then he meticulously stacked that 6-foot by 6-foot tower of rocks around her. He called Sheila on Sunday. She was on the road, headed back from Santa Barbara. She testified that he told her that he and Joy split. She was asked if he told her that Joy cut herself, and she said yes. She was asked if he told her to do something when she got home, and she said yes. What was it she was asked? To clean up, she answered. And that is what she did. She cleaned up the blood in Joy's bedroom and in the bathroom. Goff did not arrive home until Monday with that SUV that he had rented, and she also helped him clean that out too, as it was covered with dirt and debris. She inquired as to where he had gone, and he explained to her that he went for a long drive in order to cope with his grief over the breakup with Joy. Sheila chose to believe his story. The prosecutor asked her, how was it she was buying all of this? All the blood, the rented SUV, the weird tools, Joy being gone. Didn't it add up to something more sinister? She simply stated that she didn't believe that he would do something like that to their family. The prosecutor had painted Goff as a monster, but was it true? The only way Goff was going to be able to try and portray himself any differently would be for him to take the stand. And while on the stand, he admitted to killing Joy, but he claimed it was in self-defense. Whenever a defendant is going to use self-defense as a justification for a killing, he or she pretty much has to take the stand and tell the story. Nobody else, including the defense attorney, can tell it for their client. And Goff's attorney had his work cut out for him. He had been defending criminals in the San Diego area for 22 years by that time, but the Joy Risker murder was unlike anything he had ever defended against in his career. This was indeed a damning case against his client. However, he was intent on proving to the court that the killing was justified. He explained to the jury that the prosecutor had their story all twisted around. This was not a cold, premeditated murder, that it was Joy who initiated the brutal attack against his client, and he in turn had to kill her in order to defend his own life. And what about that post-mortem mutilation of Joy's body? The smashing of the face, the sawing off of the fingertips and the upper and lower jaw? That, his defense attorney says, was Goff's misguided way of trying to hide what he had done so their children would not have to be raised without a mother or a father. His strategy would be to have to help the jury reimagine Goff, chip away at the picture the prosecution had portrayed of him, and, in essence, humanize his client by allowing him to take the stand and tell his story. Goff started off by playing the religion card right out of the gate, telling the jury he had given his life to Jesus when he was 6. He definitely played up the faith as much as he possibly could, all the while attempting to downplay the polygamy. He insisted that they were not hiding the fact that they were in a polygamous relationship, that they were open and honest about it with everyone in their lives. It wasn't something to be ashamed of. He then meandered into defending himself against the facts of the case against him. that incriminating shopping trip 6 days before Joy's death, Goff claimed, contradicting all the previous testimony, that he truly was a handyman, and that quote-unquote murder kit the prosecution accused him of assembling was for home improvement projects that he had planned for that weekend. The hacksaw was for a pipe that was sticking out in the yard. The plastic sheeting was to keep paint from dripping on the floor. And the butcher knife? That was a purchase Joy had requested. Of course, both you and I know that the likely story is that the hacksaw was for mutilating Joy, the drip cloths for keeping blood from getting on the floor, not paint, and the butcher knife used just as its name describes, to butcher. And never mind the fact that none of these things, along with the other $400 worth of items, was ever recovered. So what exactly was Goff going to say initiated all of this in the first place? Well, he definitely had a card up his sleeve, and he was ready to play it. He accused Joy of child abuse. And on that final romantic evening when the subject came up, she became very angry and threatening. He said he was going to have to take the kids away because of it. He claims that she told him that she never would allow him to take the kids away from her. And her anger intensified when he confronted her with a picture that showed proof of injuries that she caused their youngest son. But did he have this picture? No. Did his attorney present the supposed picture to the court? No. Why not? Couldn't this kind of evidence prove his story to be true? Yeah, it might have, if it all weren't a lie that Goff had concocted in order to save himself. What was it that sent Joy into a blind murderous rage? Well, according to him, it's when he told her that he was kicking her out and keeping the children, that the gravy train was over for her. That's when she lost it, ran and grabbed a knife and reappeared in the doorway, wielding it in her hand. And then she attacked him, he says. He claims she was yelling at him. She came at him with this knife, swinging it violently towards him, shouting, "You son of a bitch, I will kill you." Then he testified that he punched her twice, but she still kept coming. And then he became frightened, very frightened. He felt like she was seriously going to try and kill him. So in that life or death moment, it was either going to be her or him. Him, struggling for the sake of his life. He grabbed her by the hand and was holding that knife, and he managed to twist it all around, point it towards her, and as they were fighting over control of the knife, he plunged the knife into her, saving his own life. He then took the knife and stabbed her again and again and again. And then he said she kind of just went limp. He went on, describing entering a state of shock and panic. He tried to save her by performing CPR on her, he says. But when he pulled the knife out of her, all this blood came gushing out as well. And when he checked for breathing and a pulse, there was none. He said he then contemplated what to do next, asking himself if he should call the police, but he was afraid they wouldn't believe him and his story that he was in fear for his life and the lives of their children. But then it dawned on him that he had just done this to his children's mother, and now they were going to have to live without her. And if he were to go to jail for this, they would have to live without him as well. He found himself faced with this dilemma, a moral one for the preacher to have to make. What was the right thing to do? For him, the right thing to do was to cover up what he had done. So he tasked himself with attempting to conceal Joy's identity. He brought her to the bathroom. He said he needed to remove her fingertips so she couldn't be identified by her prints. He also said that in order to further conceal her identity that he would have to remove her teeth as well. So using an old saw from the garage, not the brand new one that he had just purchased, he sawed off her fingertips, her upper jaw, and her lower jaw. He said doing so was so horrifying and sickening. And part of me believes that this is somewhat true, a true reflection as to how he was feeling when doing all of these things to his wife. He said he couldn't look at her. He said he tried to arrange some towels around her so he didn't have to look at anything other than where he was cutting. And then he put her into a large plastic container and he put her into that rented SUV. Then he cleaned up, got rid of the saw and the knife and the bloody towels, and then took a shower. And then at daybreak, he claims to have driven aimlessly, finding himself 250 miles away in the Arizona desert where he entombed Joy, covering her up one rock at a time. That was his way, he says, of showing her some kind of respect after everything he had done. In closing arguments, Goff's attorney took his best shot at bringing about the inkling of reasonable doubt in regards to the prosecution's theory. They had to be convinced that it was not possible for Joy to have brought that knife into the bedroom, into that argument, if they were going to go with the theories of the prosecutor. But it would be the prosecutor who would have the last word. He asked the jury this: what would Joy say? He told the jury she would say that she has told you the story. She told you with her blood in the house, and she told you that this crime is so unspeakable with her hands that are missing her fingers. He implored the jurors to listen to her. So what would they make of all this? Details so horrific, they can make your stomach churn. He admitted to killing and mutilating Joy. But was it cold, calculating, premeditated murder? Or was it an effort to save his own life? In the end, the jurors found Goff to be incredibly disingenuous. They did not believe him, and what's more, they were insulted that he sat up there and lied to them. He had an air of arrogance that they found offensive, and he came off completely wrapped up in his own life, so full of himself. His arrogance left a very sour taste in their mouths, as he gave the impression that this whole thing was his world and they were the ones living in it. Also, when Goff sat up there and sniffled and stammered and quivered his voice in speaking of that last night with Joy, they did not see one single tear streaming down his face. They just weren't going to let Goff have it his way anymore. They weren't going to allow him to excuse himself from having chopped up his wife's body and walk away. It only took them 2 hours, and I wouldn't be surprised if they had made up their minds right away and collectively chose to give it the courtesy 2 hours before they handed the judge their verdict. And they found him guilty. In September of 2006, almost 3 years after he murdered Joy, Goff was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. And in the end, he was still a man who has not a shred of remorse, because how he saw it, Joy was to blame. She brought all of this upon herself. His sorrow, his grief, his sadness, it was all for himself. And he continues to maintain his certainty that he has found peace and forgiveness, and he will find his way to heaven because God sent his son to die for his trespasses. And when he sees Joy in heaven, she too will forgive him. If she wouldn't forgive him, then she wouldn't be in heaven. And that brings this episode 30 to a close. Can you guys believe we've made it to 30 episodes? And that's just your weekly, regularly scheduled programming, not including all of the bonus episodes and specials that I've been trying to include each week as well. I promised as the show continues to grow, it's going to enable me to bring about more bonus content, especially with the help of all of you who have taken the time to visit the California Dreaming Patreon page and contribute to creating this show. I can't tell you enough how grateful I am for the support. And don't forget to email me if you haven't received a card and show stickers from me. I realize some of you have picked the no reward option, but I send cards anyway. The email is californiapod@yahoo.com. California Dreaming has now found a home on the Orbital Jigsaw Network. We have joined forces with an amazing group of podcast shows and hosts, including The Concession Stand, Busted Wide Open, Super Nerds UK, The Dirty Bits, Historium, Is This Adulting, 41 Owned, and Film Roast. You can find all of us on www.orbitaljigsaw.com. And guess what? We also have launched the Orbital Jigsaw Podience Facebook group. All of us from Orbital Jigsaw are on there, along with a bunch of other hosts from some of your favorite shows, and some of our biggest and best podcast listeners and fans. It's more than just talking about our shows, but rather it's an interactive group where we share ideas, articles, and news about all things podcast and social media related, and much more. It's a fun place to get new ideas, share your experiences both as a host and a listener, and find out what's working and what doesn't. It's a supportive, inclusive, drama-free group. Search Orbital Jigsaw Podience, spelled Podience, and request to join. And while you're at it, don't forget to visit the California Dreaming Facebook page. Like the page and join the group. Tell me what your thoughts are about the preacher man, Sean Goff. Is the fact that this man claims to live by the standards of God, yet committed such a heinous crime, make this much more shocking? In my opinion, it wouldn't matter what his occupation was. I find it shocking regardless of what his day job happens to be. Anyway, also follow California Dreaming on Instagram and Twitter, where I try to share pictures related to each case each week if possible. This last week, I kind of pulled a Nancy Grace move and dropped a bombshell breaking news mini episode about the family held captive in a home in Paris, California. I kept staring at all of those pictures of that family, with those 13 kids at Disneyland and the weird Elvis wedding chapel, and I just couldn't take my eyes off those kids and those outfits and that bizarre haircut on that dad. If it weren't really happening, I think somebody was making this stuff up. I'll be sure to keep up to date on that story as it progresses. I think that's all I have to say for now. Thank you again for joining me for the Big 3-0. This wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for all of you listening and helping me to make this happen. You guys are the best. And until next time, sweet dreams.